This is a conversation with Dr. Andrew Davis on metaphysics of exolife. In Davis's work, he tries to connect Alfred North Whitehead's metaphysics with the work of a historian of science, Stephen Dick, and his ideas about cosmology, theology, and the potential discovery of extraterrestrial life. I have been excited to explore connections with Whitehead's philosophy for some time, and Stephen Dick's work on cosmology and extraterrestrial life played a role in motivating my doctoral thesis, Global Brain Singularity, where I cite him heavily, so I was really excited to have a chance to speak with Dr. Davis. Also, this philosophical conversation series is only the surface of Philosophy Portal. Behind the scenes, philosophyportal.online is a portal into the world of philosophy. Philosophy Portal was officially established 2 years ago and has provided high-level courses on the works of Hegel, Nietzsche, Freud, Lacan, and Zupančič. If you are new to philosophy, looking to deepen your knowledge, or need something that will complement your doctoral or professional studies in philosophy, Philosophy Portal is a great place to start. We also host conferences, produce anthologies, and are looking to expand our services in 2024. If you want to help Philosophy Portal grow, you can also help out by becoming a supporter on Patreon or a paid subscriber on Substack. Links in the description. I hope you enjoy this conversation with Dr. Davis as much as I did. Welcome to another philosophical conversation. I'm Cadell Last, and I'm here today with Andrew Davis to discuss his book, Metaphysics of Exolife. Andrew Davis is an American process philosopher. He's also a theologian, a scholar of cosmological wonder. He is the program director for the Center of Process Studies, where he researches, writes, and organizes conferences on various aspects of process and relational thought. And in this conversation, I'm really excited to have a chance to speak with someone whose work is very much inspired by the work of Dr. Stephen Dick, who's a scholar in his own right and someone who influenced my work on the singularity and cosmology, I suppose, in general, cosmic evolution and big ideas. So maybe let's start there, Andrew. What role this book, Metaphysics of Exolife, is really, you say, the meeting of Alfred North Whitehead and Stephen J. Dick. Maybe we can just start there about these thinkers, how they influenced you, and how you're putting them into conversation in this book here.
Yeah, beautiful. Yeah, well, both thinkers for me were encountered in graduate school. So it sounds like you also encountered Steve through your graduate work. And my doctoral work was at Claremont School of Theology, which on the West Coast has been the hub for many years of process philosophy, studying process metaphysics in the tradition of Whitehead. So you almost get Whitehead through osmosis just being on campus there. But I was in my early doctoral work a teaching assistant to a professor, the chair of my dissertation, Roland Faber, and we put together a course titled Religions and Exo-Life. And as I did research for that course, was putting together a lot of the reading material, I noticed this name recurring over and over again, Stephen J. Dick. And so I really was introduced to Steve's work through that course and through some of the historical study of that course. And, Steve for many years has been, he was NASA's former chief historian, the Bloomberg chair in astrobiology at Library of Congress, and for many years has been discussing not only the history of the plurality of worlds, but the impact of discovery on specifically religious and theological worldviews. So I was really introduced to Steve in that graduate period. I think it was 2017, and specifically what he called his naturalistic cosmotheology. I know we'll get into this, but naturalistic cosmotheology for him is an alternative proposal as to how theology and religion might need to respond in light of a biological universe. This is a name of his text. In other words, a universe where life and mind is pervasive, rather than just restricted to a single planet alone. So it was that early period where I began to see Steve's work important philosophically, theologically, and he expressed certain resonances with Whitehead that I thought were interesting. They were slim, but I saw sort of potential there for these two thinkers to come alongside each other and do some interesting work. It'd take a few years yet, but that was the early meeting.
Right. So at that intersection of Whitehead's philosophy and getting to know Stephen Dick, what was the what was the main opportunity you saw there in fostering that dialogue? What was the potential you saw there?
Yeah, well, that's great. Well, so one of the beginning points for Steve when it comes to how it is that theology and religions might need to change is a rejection of an anthropocentric quality and a rejection of a supernaturalistic quality. So these two elements for him seem to be strongly questioned. If indeed as we do know now, of course, we've been cosmologically decentered, and the likelihood of pervasive extraterrestrial life seems to discount both of these prevalent terrestrial notions when it comes to religious self-understanding. In addition to those, we know definitively about the unfolding cosmological evolution of our entire planetary habitat, our solar system, etc. And so Whitehead and Steve seem to really connect on these fundamental dimensions. There's important nuances there certainly, but this affirmation of cosmic evolution, this affirmation of or rejection rather of anthropocentrism and even terracentrism, right? This notion that we be restricted to our planet alone. And then this notion of supernaturalism, which both thinkers are going to come to see quite differently, but in fact, both reject supernaturalism. What that means, I think, as the conversation unfolds, is quite different. But these are some base level, we might call them presuppositions or convictions that both of them share, and then they unfold in quite different ways in the conversation.
Yeah, it's fascinating, and I mean, it's always to me.
Indeed.
It's always to me very interesting to take either two thinkers or two fields which have not had a deep dialogue or have been separated in some sense, and to see what can come by playing with those two dimensions. Usually I feel like that's where new knowledge and new thinking comes from. And just on the first reflections of your book, on the one hand, Stephen Dick maybe doesn't have a deep understanding of Whitehead necessarily, and then Whitehead, on the other hand, as far as I'm aware, correct me if I'm wrong, but as far as I'm aware, Whitehead didn't really speculate on contact with extraterrestrials for religious understanding, and so putting these two perspectives in dialogue is birthing something new in that regard. What do you think Whitehead would how do you think Whitehead would respond to a project like you're engaged in? And did he have any ideas along these lines of how contact with extraterrestrials would impact religious life and religious understanding?
Excellent. Yeah. Well, to your first comment, initially there, the book does intend to make up for what I say in the first couple of pages is twofold neglect in the scholarly literature. So on the one hand, Steve has been putting forth this naturalistic cosmotheology proposal for about 20 years, and it has not received any sustained philosophical or theological response. In fact, I think I note that a lot of it's been sort of dismissive. Oh, he just rejects classical thinking, and and we don't need to give it that much attention because it's not even really dealing with historic theological metaphysical questions. So I think that's a limitation on the one hand. On the other hand, Whitehead's thought and process thought in general has also suffered neglect in the literature as well. It hasn't been an absolute neglect. There's been some discussion, some citation of Whitehead, a few process thinkers here and there. Pierre Teilhard de Chardin is, cited far more than Whitehead, largely because he said far more. But so I see these two elements, this lacuna in the literature that this book, in one way, is trying to initially make up for. Now, when we jump to Whitehead, it's certainly the case that Whitehead was not a theologian. He was not even overtly religious in a certain sense. He's suffered a 20 or plus years of agnosticism and perhaps even atheism. The reasons for which are quite interesting. So that's important to say. So he's a philosopher. He's a metaphysician, especially in his later period when he's teaching at Harvard in the States, and he's endeavoring a way of picturing the nature of reality from the bottom all the way to the top, as it were, where from the levels of base ontology all the way up to, I won't say ontotheology, but the ontological implications of theology. And so he doesn't, in his own text, speculate overtly or at length with respect to the question of extraterrestrial life. There's a few small pieces here and there that we can leverage out creatively. Although I will say there is a great book called Dialogues of Alfred North Whitehead, and that was put together by a reporter, Lucian Price. It's widely available. And in that text, Price, who records quite lengthy statements of Whitehead, does record certain fascinating and imaginative statements that Whitehead apparently made with him, and statements that I think are consistent with his philosophy. Now, the problem with relying solely on that text is some have questioned its reliability and are skeptical about some of the claims, or at least the reputation of Price, but that's sort of a larger discussion. So the metaphysics are arguably there from which to develop interesting implications, and you can relate those to certain statements that Whitehead makes, but he doesn't make overt statements. So we're sort of being creative in Dick and bringing Steve and Dick Whitehead together in this way. But there's a precedent, I would argue, to do so.
Yeah, it's great to, I know, you know, if I was just imagining, if I was in Dick's position, for example, it would be quite an honor to have another scholar engage in such a sustained engagement, and to have your work, you know, developing for 20, 30 years and not get the attention perhaps it deserves. That maybe, you
Yeah,
know, someone else taking the time to give this sustained engagement is something that will push the contributions of his discourse as well.
yeah, and I think that's an important point. Also because, and I lay this out in the intro too of the book, Steve has called the best of our disciplines to contribute to this discussion, in particular philosophers and theologians. You know, so he sort of put this call out there, and in my estimation, there hasn't been, you know, that much response. There's certainly been philosophies of astrobiology, philosophies of cosmology, etc. But this interest of philosophers in this question, I think, is only growing, and in part, I'm responding to this call that Steve has offered. So Steve and I did meet. We've met at a conversation online, certainly at the Cobb Institute on this material. I could send that to you. But he also attended a conference in 2022 in Salem, Oregon, the title of which was Astrobiology, Exophilosophy, and Cosmic Religion. And so the purpose of that conference was to gather key voices from NASA, elsewhere, key philosophers, scientists, theologians, and historians to discuss some of the implications of process thinking, process philosophy to this discussion. So that was my first meeting of Steve. It was great. We've been in contact ever since, and his response has been very positive. He's happy, as you say, that his work is being furthered and considered even at a philosophical level, even though, you know, he'll probably find places to push back or raise questions. He's not a philosopher. He's a historian, but he certainly has a philosophical bent in some respects. So it's an unfolding conversation, certainly.
And it's a very fascinating conversation. So let's dive into sort of the stakes here, because when you think of the origin of religion, you think about the origin of a metaphysical systems, belief systems, which appeared, had their genesis at a very different time in human history than, let's say, what humans know about themselves and the universe since the emergence of modern science. And everything that we've learned in this specific case, let's say mostly about cosmology, but also
Yeah.
hypotheses about, like you say, a universe where biology and mind are playing a much more extended role than is traditionally conceived. And then in regards to those 2 points about the anthropocentrism and the supernaturalism, when you think about religion historically speaking, you think about, I mean, I always traditionally conceived religion as something engaging in relationship to a supernatural entity, praying to a supernatural entity, having a personal connection to a supernatural entity, something eternal, something which is not secular, something not of this world. And then in the terms of the anthropocentrism, that humans have a special place, that humans have a special connection to this supernatural entity. And in the Christian language anyway, God loves us, and God created us in his image, and all of these dimensions, which you could argue make human beings feel at home in the universe, or give us a sense of divine purpose or connection. Now, in regards to this specific inquiry, what's so interesting about it is that cosmology and our knowledge of science has opened up such a vast picture of the reality that we're really living in. Hundreds of billions of stars in our solar system, hundreds of billions of galaxies throughout the universe, all with the same physical laws and chemical compositions and so forth. The likelihood and the probability of other life is very high. Of course, we haven't found it, but on a first thought, in first stimulation on this question, if we were to discover biological life, or if we were to discover another civilization, what do you think would be the response from religion? What do you think would necessarily have to change? What is the challenge that you're trying to frame here?
Yeah, that's a great way of putting it. And we certainly have learned so much. I think of, just as you're speaking, 1993 was the first time we discovered an extrasolar planet. That is a planet outside our solar system, which is really remarkable. This is not that long ago, and we've come to, tally 5,000+ and increasing more. And as you say, we know that every star potentially has planets, many of which could be akin to ours. So it's a very ripe time for a lot of this discussion to be coming back. And I say coming back because it has been, as Steve has documented, an ancient conversation, starting from the Greek atomists, potentially before, all the way up through the ages. And so the response of theology, the response of religion, it can certainly be various. History has demonstrated that. You've had those who've been positively hostile to the notion, right? Precisely because of commitments to more anthropocentric or supernaturalistic tendencies, and those who've been extremely open to it. I think of Giordano Bruno, who suffered the unfortunate fate of being burnt at the stake at 1600, in part because of this speculative imagination on both scientific and theological fronts. Now today, that is vastly open. It's commonplace for us to speculate widely, theologically and philosophically. And I think that this one place where I push back at Steve a bit, and others too, because it's not so obvious to me that Steve is positively informed by a religious or theological tradition. And that's one way I argue that he might, through encountering Whitehead, incorporate some of the wisdom of that tradition when it comes to his own cosmotheology, which is quite different from a lot of more classical theologies. But I think people are surprised to see that religions, although very fundamentalist and narrow conservative forms, will potentially have issues with this. Many of the popular religious discourse, scholars who are thinking along the lines of science and religion, are welcoming this conversation. There's interesting early histories of Christian thinkers, not just Christian faith, of course. I mean, that's my sort of background, but being open to this. And in the same way that they've been open to other revolutions of science, whether the Darwinian revolution, the quantum revolution, there could be a revolution of life and mind and its pervasiveness in the universe, and religion are going to have to come to terms with that. And so some have wanted to argue that religious systems have been able to evolve with respect to these other findings of cosmology, and this it would be then a short step in some way to evolve further in light of a biological universe. So I think religions have more resources than people actually think. And when I say that, I'm thinking of just sort of Western religions. Certainly, Eastern philosophical religious systems have been much more open to cyclical notions of cosmological time, infinite plenitude of planets with vast numbers of inhabited beings. This has sort of been a part of their cosmology in a way that is not so obvious in the West. So it's not us to say Western religions are not able to incorporate that. But it's quite a fascinating discussion that is really current. It's ongoing and has every different interest, I think, interest from people from the top of scholarship to just a layperson and UFO phenomena. It's quite an interesting spectrum that religions are endeavoring here. But my own perspective is that they will certainly survive and evolve and incorporate whatever these findings are. And in fact, I would suggest that they would have to remain credible in a deep way. I think Steve and I would agree on that front.
I mean, whenever this topic comes up, it reminds me of the famous decenterings that I think constitute scientific history. So the decenterings from the center of the universe, solar system, the decentering of life, of course, the decentering of the solar system, Copernicus, the decentering of life, Darwin, depending on what sort of orientation, the decentering of our own minds with the unconscious, or different perspectives on the relationship of our mind. But then here this decentering seems to be, of course, it's not it's something that is speculative, it's something that's hypothetical, but the decentering of another life form, a non-Earth life form, or the decentering of another intelligent civilization would, to me, be the ultimate decentering. It's like decentering
Yeah.
of the decenterings, and in that regard, how, in order for religion to be able to adapt and survive, do you think, like you've already suggested in some sense, some denominations would adapt their metaphysics would be more easy to accommodate this revelation? Or yeah, do you think there would be some religions that died out, some religions that survived on the basis of this? Or, you know, what are your ideas around this idea?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I fully I think the cosmological decenterings, that the different layers you consider here are factual, you know. But we don't know, of course, about the last one there, the civilizational decentering. But it seems very likely, given what we now know about the universe, um, that we will be civilizationally decentered. Now, I think that um, religions, it's just tough to say, but I think religions are going to um, evolve into that decentering in a way that widens their theological and metaphysical picture. So it's important to say that a religion like Christianity, or a theological system like Christianity, um, it doesn't come with necessarily a set metaphysics. So one of the great statements that Whitehead makes is that Christianity has always been a religion seeking a metaphysics. Right? In other words, it's based on these claims of history on a terrestrial planet, but it doesn't tell you how it is that the world works. It doesn't tell you reveal metaphysical kinds of questions about the nature and constituents of reality. These are something that we're seeking to embed these historic claims within. So while our cosmological decentering is an incontrovertible fact, I think religions must face that, there's a deeper metaphysical recentering that could arguably happen, which would still connect us to this world in a deep and significant sense. And I think we have to say that, even though it would be tentative, metaphysics is always tentative. We have to say that because we're part of this universe, every bit as much as a plant of soil and rain, or what have you. Right. So we haven't fallen into the universe from somewhere else. We're in part what the universe is up to and what the universe is doing. And I think if we start at that experiential level as belonging, at least as an expression of this universe, we have a place to start when moving back downward over, if you want, levels of reality to see what it may be at the base, what ontology might be like at the most fundamental level. So I think that's an approach that process thinkers, Whitehead in general, and thinkers who follow him have taken, right? That we're an expression of nature, and by that fact, we have insights, resources, and clues as to the nature of ontology, the nature of what's going on. Right? Those could be leveraged to other planets. But if I jump theologically, much of it depends also on what you think God is up to, as it were. Um, some have made the claim, and I think it's a coherent one, that if the universe proceeds from benevolence, right, if goodness is at the foundation of divine existence or divine being or the universe, then plenitude necessarily follows from that. So some religious thinkers would say, why is it that God should be in any way limited in terms of a world that God creates? Why not create as many good worlds as is possible? And wouldn't that be in the nature of a divine reality to do that? So, I mean, these are sort of metaphysical levels, but they're a part of the discussion. And to the extent that religious folks, believers, identities are operating at that metaphysical level, I think the evolution will just continue. I think it's going to be fine. To the extent that we must maintain our specialness, our centrality, and do not, wade into these mucky waters, as it were, of metaphysics. I think profound changes will need to happen as well. So does that help? I mean, there's a
Yeah.
lot of contours of this discussion that are weaved together.
Yeah, no, I think like you're definitely pointing towards it. I think what I'm going towards is, I think the emotional impact of these decenterings is what I'm trying to probe into. So, like, for example,
Yeah.
legend has it, when Galileo's discovery of the moon circling Jupiter the church literally responded to this possibility with torture, with imprisonment, or for example, with the Darwinian discoveries. There's a great deal of hostility, cultural wars that have been going on for centuries. Even I think the idea of an unconscious is something which I think many people in religious circles see as potentially threatening in terms of bringing too much, let's say, sexual tensions to the mind and so forth that threaten normative sensibilities about morality and things like this.
Yeah.
That the discovery of another civilization of another, let's say, chosen people, or God created another intelligent being, that this would provoke huge emotional hostilities, and at the same time, it seems like you'd just be confronted with this brute fact. I guess it depends on the context of the discovery.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and I'm not sure if it would. I think it depends on the kind of person one is, the openness they have with respect to this universe. So you mentioned these great cases of decentering, um, Galileo, Darwin, Freud, psychoanalysis, etc. These are all great examples. Most of those examples now are thoroughly incorporated and accepted by at least the intelligentsia of religious scholarship and religious leadership. Um, and so the intelligentsia versus the lay and the academic dimensions, of course, might respond to this quite differently. But I think on the whole, when it comes to sophisticated intellectuals who are working within religions, as committed religious believers potentially too, they fully incorporated these notions that you mentioned. And I think it's not a large step for them to incorporate once more another decentering. Um, so I think it's really hard to talk about religion, because this is a notion that's incredibly wide ranging, incredibly diverse, as is talk of life, right? We don't have a clean definition of life. So I just think we need to define parameters and populations and groups. It'll have an existential impact. This notion that we're not alone, I think, will be quite profound. Um, and it's going to raise itself, assuming we're not alone, profound philosophical questions about the nature of this universe and what it's up to, and concomitantly theological questions as well. So it's a challenge. I don't know. Steve has leveraged some responses, right? The H.G. Wells on the radio some years ago, right? The response that happened with respect to chaos in the streets or profound worry. But then there's been other cases of deep openness to this. So I think religion has everything from the absolutely closed-minded fundamentalist to the philosophically beautiful, So we have to be careful, I think, in using just the language. I think I'm sort of struggling to think through both of those prongs in that spectrum.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, it's anyway. It's to use, let's say, the language of Whitehead. We're at this stage of the game in terms of contact with other intelligent species. We're still between, let's say, actuality and potentiality. That the question of it seems like what science does is open up an enormous potential for this discovery, but then in terms of actuality, we're still very much in the dark. But let's get in
Indeed.
maybe some of your but that also makes it probably one of the most exciting places for philosophers and for speculative ideas at the same time. But let's
I
get
certainly think so.
let's get into Dick's cosmotheology. So, well, first, maybe before I get into some of the specific aspects of it, why don't you explain what is Dick's cosmotheology, and specifically pointing towards the 6 points which structure the entire book, and then maybe we can get into some of the details.
Yeah, you bet. So Stephen Dick has defined quite simply as cosmotheology as simply a theology that takes into account what we know about the sciences, all the sciences, but cosmology in particular. Okay, and necessarily wedded to that, as we said in the beginning, is this rejection, at least he thinks, of anthropocentrism, right? At least a naive form of anthropocentrism and a naive form of supernaturalism, right? This notion that they're exterior supernatural agents, gods, divinities that are, at least in principle, able to intervene into the world from the outside and produce supernatural effects. So, I mean, those are the two sort of assumptions he brings to his naturalistic cosmotheology. And again, he uses the language of naturalistic because it's not supernaturalistic. He's going to try to make that case. But the brunt of his cosmotheology has been developed over what was initially 5 principles in his early writing, and then later became a 6th principle was added. So he's developed over the years 6 principles of naturalistic cosmotheology. And so maybe I can just list those for us if you'd like, and then we could go through each of them.
Sure. Yeah,
So
that's
Dick's first principle, okay, sure, yeah, his first principle is simply the claim that humanity is not physically central to the universe, right? And this sort of plays into these various cosmological decenterings that we've been talking about. A level up from that, the second principle is not only the claim that humanity is not physically central, but that humanity is not um, biologically, mentally, or morally central in the universe. So these biological, mental, and moral dimensions are added on to those cosmological decenterings. The third principle is the claim that humanity is not at the top of the great chain of beings in the universe, right? When we look out at the possibilities of advanced extraterrestrial life, the idea that we're at the top of that hierarchy, as it were, the hierarchy of being is very, very low in Steve's position. So he's saying we're not at the top, right? And notice that these first three principles are consist in largely what I've called cosmological decenterings, right? They're negations, essentially. We're not at the center. We're not central biologically, mentally, morally. We're not at the top. So if the first 3 principles consist in these negations, the second 3 principles, culminating to 6, then try to substantiate or work those out in significant senses. So the fourth principle is the theological claim that humanity must be open to what Steve calls radically new and non-supernatural conceptions of God. A God for him that is grounded in cosmological evolution. So again, he's calling for us theologically to take account of not the brute fact, I'd say, but the facts of cosmological evolution, to incorporate those along with our decenterings, along with our rejection of supernaturalism, into new descriptions, new renderings of God. So cosmotheology must embrace a new portrait or new portraits of God and develop those. The fifth is the claim that cosmotheology has to have a moral dimension. This is very important for Steve. That extends essentially to embrace all species in the universe, and he describes this as a kind of a reverence or a respect for life in any form. So he wants to keep that moral, that ethical dimension a part of cosmotheology. I think this is a very important part, and indeed, it certainly will be if we come in contact with other beings. And then the sixth principle is the claim that cosmotheology must embrace this idea that human destiny is linked ultimately to natural cosmic events, and not to supernatural eschatology or to the end state that certain religious systems have allowed for. So the 6 principles are quite interesting. As I mentioned, there hasn't been too much response to these principles beyond just sort of dismissal of them by certain religious figures. My interest in engaging these principles is to imaginatively invert or exchange these cosmological decenterings belonging to the first 3 for metaphysical recenterings with Whitehead, and think about what that might mean for then the subsequent development of Steve's insights over the next 3 principles: the moral dimension, the theological dimension, and this notion of destiny as well. So, but those are the 6 principles. We can dive into each one if you'd like, or bounce around.
Well, my first question is just about the lack of response in regards to the theological community. Why do you think there's a lack of response or a lack of engagement? Is it that they don't see this as engaged in the metaphysical history of the religions themselves? Is there a deeper reason behind it?
Yeah, I mean, it is hard to say. It may just be that because Steve hasn't been obviously informed by religious tradition, or doesn't speak out of a religious tradition, that the dismissal is sort of, well, you're not within this conversation enough to be able to make these claims, things go much deeper. So Ted Peters and others, for example, have argued that, well, if Steve were to read a lot of the, and certainly he has, I'm not saying he hasn't, but if he were to have some of the broader philosophical and theological resources available to him, he'd be more careful in some of the claims that he's making. But there's Oli-Pekka Viano, I believe is his name, wrote a great book called Cosmology for Theology, or something along those lines. I can send it to you, where he, in a page goes through the first 3 or 4 of Steve's principles and says, well, Orthodox Christian faith has already accounted for everything he's worried about. And therefore we can just move past those ones. And then he pays attention to maybe 1 or 2 in the next, the 5 or 6 of Steve's principles. So, I mean, it's varied. And I think the response has been that, well, religious systems already are available to what Steve's worried about and with these questions. Or they just simply don't want to read, because I think his challenges may come across as valid in some respect for at least some religious believers. So again, I struggle with the spectrum of response. The scholarly literature hasn't responded at length, and I find that unfortunate. So that, in part, that's why I'm writing this text, to stimulate conversation further.
I mean, in regards to the first 3 negations, I feel like that brings us back around to what we were discussing about, Copernicus, Darwin, Freud, and all of those decenterings. But in regards to your sort of innovations in this book, it seems to be at the level of a logical maneuver, in some sense, the maneuver of thinking about this from the point of view of negation, to thinking about this from, I think you say, exemplification, and this movement from negation to exemplification might not be immediately intuitive to people. So maybe we could go into a little bit of what you mean by, so when we talk about humanity as not physically central, if we talk about humanity's biology, mind, morality is not central, that we're not the top. These are all the crucial thing here is not. So the logical negation involved in all of these statements. And so what does it mean to shift a perspective from a negation to exemplification?
Yeah, well, that's great. And so, in one way to put that, and I do in the book, is an inverse. I'm speaking of an inversive method approach to Steve's principles. So what he has negated cosmologically, I actually want to reaffirm metaphysically. So this negation to an affirmation. So as the book develops, you see that mirroring Dick's 6 principles are the development of 6 alternative Whiteheadian principles that I'm developing, that are essentially metaphysical principles. So I make the case that Steve's principles are operating largely only at the level of cosmology, whereas in principle, metaphysics is an arena from which that is deeper than cosmological contingencies. And so I use Whitehead to kind of do that. So with respect, for example, to the first principle, right? Steve says we are not physically central. We are no way physically central to the universe. I want to fully agree, but also insist, and this is the inversion, the exemplification, that humanity, in fact, exemplifies metaphysical principles that are utterly central to the universe. And again, that's based in this claim. Again, there's no dogmatic claim about what the metaphysics is. Whitehead gives us a way of entering that. But that we are part of this universe is something we have to face philosophically. In the modern period, it's Whitehead's critique that much of science, much of philosophy inadequately abstracted or bifurcated the human experiential element from nature, right? We pretended we could approach nature as purely objective without recourse to the fact that we are expressing it, feeling it, living it every day. So we may be cosmologically decentered. We're absolutely physically not the central, but we are metaphysically central, to the extent that we have nowhere else to begin but our experience as an expression of this universe. When we think about it, it's what it's ultimately up to, what its nature and constituents are like. So that's an example just of the cosmological decentering inverted into metaphysical recentering. We are metaphysical exemplifications of what this universe is up to. Now, people may disagree about the metaphysics, but that we are expressive of the universe and its ultimate principles is something we have to come to terms with. And so that's a place to begin. Now, with respect to the second principle, did you want to jump in on?
Well, well, let's
Yeah.
go to the second principle after discussing this. I think what's a crucial point you're
Okay.
making, and make sure that we get this point clear, which is this relationship between the subject and the object. Basically, is what is a different picture of the subject and the object. So, and I think this
Yeah.
maneuver you're making is absolutely crucial. Is that, yeah? I mean, I think with the naive, let's say, unreflective metaphysics of natural science, we have this idea of an objective universe out there in which we're not subjectively implicated. But I think the crucial thing that you're saying there is that there's no point from which we can escape our own locus, as it were. There's no point where we can, get an objective picture of, let's say, the moon or the solar system or the galaxy, independent of our own observations and independent of our own technological interventions. And so, I've heard many people refer to this movement in various different ways, but would you say metaphysically this is a stance of non-dual? Is this a non-dual perspective, or is it how do you make sense of what you're trying to do in terms of the metaphysical language?
Yeah, that's tough. Which language to use? Well, I'm not making a claim of, say, idealism or just pure subjectivism, but I think absolutely there's a real world. There's an objective world, but that the avenue to get to understanding it is through our experience and not by disregarding it, right? And I think this is such a fundamental claim, belonging not just to Whitehead's philosophy, but to the philosophical endeavor going all the way back. Know thyself, right? Why? Because something that is expressive in thyself can be generalized outward and be revelatory about the nature and constituents of this universe. So what I call it non-dual, I just think we are an exemplification of this universe. And I think that can be expressed in different language. I don't know how to get away from that claim, and be at all connected to this universe. It's not as if we plopped in from somewhere else. We grew out of it like a plant out of soil. And if that's the case, what is expressed at high levels in the plant is still connected to the nature of the soil. They have to have a consistency and uniformity there. So again, I do believe that there's a metaphysical uniformity across nature and that we express that, and that's a way of recentering us, right? The universe produced us. It produced life, mind, meaning, morality. Even before we got here, these potentialities were harbored in the nature of things. And that, to me, is quite exciting, but it's a haunting sort of metaphysical fact that the universe seems to be an exploration of infinitudes of possibility, the kind of which have been expressed in us, perhaps. So I'm not drawing any wedge between human beings and the world. I think we are the world. Our body is the most intimate experiential mode of knowing what the world is like. And it's from there that we begin to strategically, carefully consider the wider universe. Does that help?
Yeah, very clear. So I did have maybe some other questions that grow out of that, but I also want to be mindful of your emphasis on going to the second point, where I think that question will naturally find its place.
Right. Okay. So again, the negation with respect to the second principle for Steve is that we're not biologically, mentally, or morally central. Excellent. An inverted claim metaphysically with respect to that would be something along the lines of humanity exemplifies biological, mental, and moral antecedents that are metaphysically central to the nature of things. That, again, that claim emerges from this notion that we're metaphysically central. The universe is expressive of excuse me, let me put it different, that in us, the universe has come to express itself, and that these particular domains, the organic, the living, the mental, or the experiential, and the moral, have antecedent metaphysical dimensions that can be read back over nature, that can be read back arguably into one's ontology. And this is precisely what Whitehead does we face a problem that if the universe is at its base level, at its most natural state, is simply dead, which is largely the modern view. It's what Hans Jonas called an ontology of death, right? That our ontology is a reductive materialism where there is really no life. We face the real difficult issue of how it is that life, mind, and meaning can emerge from that universe. So there's a philosophical debate about how it is we relate to this universe and whether or not these elements we find expressed in living mental and moral lives can be retrospectively found even at the lowest levels of ontology. And I'm making the case that it can. So Whitehead uses the language of organism, the philosophy of organism. He says physics is the study of the smaller organisms, biology is the study of the larger organisms, right? This organic analogy, this organic metaphor, which for me locates an element of life, or at least characteristics of life, all the way down in nature. Of course, it's not living in the ways that we understand it. We're very high exemplifications, evolutionary expressions, and achievements of that life. But that there is a livingness to ontology that even the ancients saw in some respect that I think we can still argue for. We might arguably say the same thing about this mental dimension that Steve is bringing up. So certainly we're not mentally central, but the universe has to be consistent with producing mind, since that's what it did. And arguably we can locate experience through nature to animals, to even insects, yeah, even lower, right? There's interesting articles about panpsychism, panexperientialism, decision-making bacteria. Well, what is it that we would ultimately not grant experience to? And at least for Whitehead and process thinkers, experience is another thing, in addition to this living dimension that goes all the way down in nature. So David Ray Griffin called that panexperientialism. So life and mind arguably go all the way down into one's ontology. And it's only in that sense that we can make sense of high-grade expressions of those in evolutionary forms here. The last thing I'll say is just that this value dimension, this moral element, at least for Whitehead, values are real in the nature of things. They're not just subjectively invented. In part, they're discovered, even though that's a much larger sort of discussion. But he makes the claim that aesthetic value is the widest and most inclusive form of value that's applicable to the universe. And it's only at high evolutionary expressions or achievements of aesthetic value that a moral kind of consciousness arises. So we might think of, morality or ethics at the level of the early universe, and firing electrons doesn't really seem to have a place. But he would argue that aesthetic value does. Aesthetic intensity, aesthetic order is in the nature of things. And that aesthetic value or aesthetic order is the context in which moral value later emerges at high levels. So you might see that the moves that I'm making here is that the antecedents of the biological, mental, and moral domain are in the ontology at the level of organism, at the level of experience, at the level of aesthetic value. And it's this context that it's in our ontology that allows these things to find high-grade exemplifications later. That's what I'm attempting to do. And there's been a lot of work on each of those. And panpsychism is coming back into popularity in a way that's quite interesting. So maybe you have a comment on that.
Yeah, I would like to dive into sort of the cracks of this second principle. It seems like there's a lot at stake and a lot that's still very speculative, at least to my understanding. Sure. So I guess my first question is this juxtaposition with a reductive materialism, where we sort of have a division between non-living inanimate matter and living or animate matter. Right. And then the classical division between the two, the separation between the two, where in the physical sciences it's very difficult to bridge the gap. And so there's work done on I've read a lot of the literature, for example, on what's called abiogenesis, the birth of life from non-life, for example. Or for example, in some other literature, there's concepts like autopoiesis, which is trying to get at this sort of basic process by which life can be defined as a self-making entity. in regards to these endeavors, are these attempts to reify the distinction between life and non-life? Is it still too sharp a divide? Or and then I guess secondarily is, how can we know, by what processes can we know that, let's say, atomic constituents are alive or have experience? So what does that mean?
Yeah. So to the first comment there, which is a good one, just to speak for Whitehead for a moment, he rejected any absolute distinction between living and non-living organic systems. So did a figure like Teilhard de Chardin, who's often a part of the modern process discussion as well. And as you say, the autopoiesis and abiogenesis, these discussions are quite interesting because we're trying to get how it is that life emerges from non-life. But by speaking of non-life or pre-life, we're not speaking of something that's lifeless, or we're not speaking about something that's dead, right? So to speak of non-life is not to speak of death. And I think that's an important thing. If anything, we're speaking about a context which, if not yet living, has the potentiality for life, and that potentiality itself is quite interesting as to why that should be there. So I do think that this distinction between living and non-living is not heightened recently. I think it's blurred even further, and it would make sense working backward from our lives. Again, we're part of this universe, to leverage ourselves down to it makes sense that distinction gets blurred. We don't know at any one moment when something becomes absolutely living. It seems to be that non-life is sort of the limit case of life, but non-life is not death. What do you think about that? I mean, because this is a sort of difficult thing. I think of this gets into thinking about a living ontology as well, and not a dead ontology. If there's a dead ontology, fundamentally, how the hell do we get here in the kinds of forms that we see it? What do you think about that?
Well, the first thing I appreciate, I really rack my head over this and try to think about this. But the first thing I appreciate about what you're saying is, and I fundamentally agree, is I like the way you're thinking about it, is non-life is not death. I like that. That makes a lot of sense to me. And also the other thing I really like is when you say non-life, we're talking about a non-life which has the potentiality for life, and that's something that's something intrinsically very interesting. Where I don't know if I can go all the way is, what does it mean when Whitehead says physics is the study of smaller organisms and biology is the study of large organisms? Why call it an organism? And then, like, for example, that brings me to the question, I guess, of something like what Schrodinger would ask is, what is life, or what is an organism? And then for me, I've already referenced autopoiesis. Is, at least in my studies of autopoiesis, that concept gave me something to work with that I found was helpful in regards to something that's self-making and forming a boundary which has an internal reaction and an internal sense of direction. What would it, like, I guess what I'm asking is, what would it be in, let's say, chemistry or physics, which would require us to think of this realm as life, as opposed to like what we said earlier was non-life? We're not talking about death. I'm not saying atoms are death. That might be an anthropocentric projection.
Indeed. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, so that's a great point. And it's hard to say what it is in chemistry or the physical sciences that are going to reveal this to us. Again, we have to operate from the fact that we're expressive of this chemistry, but beneath the chemistry, beneath the physics, arguably, is a kind of ontology. Now, Whitehead, of course, was a mathematical physicist. He's very familiar with all this, was influenced in writing in the time of the quantum revolutions and revolutions in developmental biology. So, but he is developing an ontology that for him is not only aims to be consistent with all that is found in the arguably the organic turn of these sciences, but also expressive of our experience. So you asked first about the question of organisms. So in a sense, there's a certain continuity he may be drawing by saying that, well, we know there's organisms in biology, and by a certain form of retrospective induction or logic, we must also say that there's organismic like elements even at the level of physics. So you mentioned interiority. This is actually quite important. It's a larger, of course, philosophical discussion. But one thing that wasn't allowed on a reductive sort of mechanistic understanding, materialistic understanding, was internal relationality, internal relationships. At least for Whitehead, there's not merely external relationships through efficient causation, right? The past feeding into the present, influencing the present. For him, this level of interiority that's so highly advanced in human life, interior subjectivity, life, consciousness, is also a part of the ontology. So that it's not just the case that efficient causation reigns, but that an element of feeling, of interiority, of final causation even, belongs even at the level of ontology. So now with respect to the question of life, Whitehead would even suggest in his book, Modes of Thought, it's a great text. I actually recommend that to students and interested beginners. It's more readable than some of his other texts. But he says that even at the level of ontology, we see expressed what he says is the characteristics of life. And he names three of them. The first is self-enjoyment, right? That an event, because this isn't just dead matter, an emerging event is something in and for itself. It's experiential in it for itself. It has an element of enjoyment. It has an element of creative activity, right? It has, again, this ability to navigate the possible in some way and cut off a certain possibility to become actualized. And third would be this element of aim, right? That there's certain aims, even potentially at the level of ontology, that can be satisfied, that can be expressed. And again, we see that expressed in our own high level aims, that which seem to be replete. So again, I think Whitehead's using that language carefully. The livingness of organisms at the level of physics is certainly not at the level of biology or higher, arguably, but it is a livingness nonetheless, at least for him. I don't know if science or physics can confirm that for us, but it is suggesting things quite a bit that seem consistent with that kind of ontology. I think that there's a tension there, you know.
And I want to stay with that tension is on the one hand,
sure,
what would it mean for science to take up a Whiteheadian project and, as it were, confirm some of these speculative notions that we really do live in a living universe? Like, and this is maybe, it's not as strange as you might think. For example, like and a lot here I think depends on metaphor. Like, for example,
yeah.
When we think about the Newtonian universe, we use the metaphor of a clockwork, which is something non-living and something mechanical that's sort of wound up and operating by deterministic principles. But Einstein, I was reading, used the metaphor of a mollusk for the curved space-time. So it was like Einstein actually used an organic metaphor for the universe. And I think actually Plato used an organic metaphor for the universe as well. So
that's right.
So on the one hand, I can totally sort of, and I've also been a part of, I don't know if you know, the Evo-Devo community, the evolutionary development community, but they also prefer an organismic view of the universe. And you can think about, for example, this is, to me, I find very metaphorically useful, enlightening, is, you know, the Big Bang is like birth. Cosmic evolution is like the growth of the universe. Then the heat death would be the senescence of the universe. And then this is very speculative, hypothetical. They say maybe intelligent beings create new universes, and that we're reproductive nodes of the universe, so that you could situate a life history in the universe, which is very nice in my mind. That's fun to think about, and maybe even useful scientifically. But what would be, in your mind, what would be the possibilities, the conditions of possibility for a physics community to take up a Whiteheadian approach to physics? Would it have any meaningful scientific consequences? Or on the other hand, is this not merely, but is this something that gives us a greater sense of home in the universe? Is it a religious or a theological sense, in the way you're talking about, a religious and theological sense of being a part of something which is much greater than ourselves, and which is not indifferent, but as it were, constituents which are on more of a continuum with us?
Yeah, that's great. So I'll maybe comment on the first side of that. And of course, I fully agree that metaphors are so important. They've been a part of our understanding um, and engagement with the world since the very beginning. You mentioned Plato with the clockwork universe too. But yeah, for Whitehead, again, and he's one of a number of thinkers, you mentioned Einstein too, who have shifted more to thinking about what this organic metaphor might mean. I think, just to say a little more about that, organisms have internal relations, organisms have spontaneity, organisms have creativity, organisms grow, and organisms develop. Arguably, these are all dimensions that cannot be at all assigned to a clock or a machine or a mechanical kind of universe. So they're thoroughly appropriate metaphors, again, partly because we are expressive of those in our own experience. Now, the physics community, I'm happy to say that the physics community and key voices in the physics community have been very open to the insights of Whitehead's thinking. Because again, Whitehead is not just a absolute speculative metaphysician that's disconnected from the findings of science. He's precisely developing a metaphysics based upon the crumbling of this Newtonian Cartesian metaphysical system. So he saw a crack in the wall, as it were, and behind it is this fluid organic universe that he's attempting to develop. So thinkers like Timothy Eastman, for example, a plasma physicist, just came out with a new text, is very much influenced by Whitehead's thinking. And there's a number of others. There's books on physics in Whitehead, quantum physics in Whitehead, and increasingly number of texts that are relating his metaphysical systems to new findings in physics. And we might just think a little bit about what happened to matter, right? This notion of dead brute matter. When the scientific revolutions in the quantum world at least took place, it's like matter, as Whitehead says, dissolved into something far more fluid and energetic. What we find at the base of the physical world is not pulpy, dead, inactive, arguably insentient pieces of matter. We find flows of energy exchange. We find relationships. And now Whitehead would even say that the physicist's concept of energy is really just an abstraction from the firing of events that are internal to these energy. And he actually gives us a picture of what these events are like and how they emerge and how they relate. And it's at the level of these events internal to the base of energy where he finds this element of spontaneity of experience, potentially life or pre-life, but not death. So it's an emerging conversation. And scientists will be interested in it to the extent that they believe that they need a metaphysics to support what they're discovering. Some scientists are quite dogmatic and think that metaphysics and philosophy is just a waste of time. Whitehead was a wonderful scientist. Eddington, Planck, Einstein, these are all folks who at the height of their scientific genius did not dismiss philosophy. And I think that's science and philosophy, although one at one point, right, in our history, have become unfortunately deeply separate. There's reasons for that, important reasons, but science presupposes arguably a metaphysics. And if that's the case, we need philosophers. So, I mean, what do you think?
I certainly agree that we need philosophers, and I guess I wouldn't be trying to do philosophy portal without that.
Yeah, what would we do?
No,
out of a job.
Yeah. I think they need each other, and I like. I always find it to be precious when there is those flows of dialogue which are sort of mutually respectful and also mutually informed. Where there's a different type of reading, there's a different type of research, there's a different type of way in which you come to a discussion that I think is required in order to create that bridge between science and philosophy. But it's certainly one that I would like to participate in and cultivate. But
yeah, I think of one statement by Whitehead just quickly. He says, there's no shortcut to truth. And he says, science requires a metaphysics, theology requires a metaphysics. They all require each other, right? So it's this appeal to no longer operate through siloed disciplines, but to draw from all of them and their wisdom to try to come to a more cohesive understanding of what is really the case. And I have deep affinities with that.
Well, I think maybe the only person who doesn't need a metaphysics is Heidegger or something like that. No, but I just go back. I wanted to actually ask,
or Hawking,
or Hawking, or Hawking, right? Hawking and Heidegger, yeah, that's a coffee. But let's get those two together, maybe in the afterlife.
Yeah, sure.
No. So, but I did want to ask a theoretical question. So, like, I wanted to bring back that fundamental point about, like you said, there is an objectivity. I think it's always hard to word this, but to get this right, I think is crucial. There is an objectivity, but we get to know, we can't eliminate the fact that we get to know that objectivity through our subjectivity.
Exactly.
And including that in the picture. So and then I want to connect that to what you were saying about Whitehead, who's saying that there, like, for example, just as an example, there's an aesthetic intensity. There's an aesthetic intensity in the nature of things. So let's say in the objectivity of the universe at the subatomic level and so forth, Whitehead saying there's an aesthetic intensity. But then my question is, how can we differentiate between our own subjectivity projecting that into the things versus the things in themselves? Is there a way to disentangle this? Is there a method that he's using? Are there specific arguments that deal with these issues?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very hard question. Because again, Whitehead is often referred to, along with William James and others in the American philosophical tradition, as a radical empiricist, right? To express this notion that the empirical element, experience, is absolutely fundamental and the focal point of philosophizing. So now, obviously, we cannot inhabit the experience of a bat or a tick or an electron, but that they have experience in some way that belongs at the level at which they operate is, for Whitehead, taken as an assumption, as an inductive assumption, working backward and downward. Again, I call it retrospective induction through levels of reality, where these elements that we find in high-grade forms never fully disappear. Life never fully becomes death. Mind never fully becomes mindless. Value never becomes absolutely devoid of value. So the question of aesthetic value in Whitehead's philosophy is really deeply an aesthetic philosophy, an axiological philosophy. Intensity has to do with order, with the volume, right? I like to think of it as sort of a musical metaphor, that the evolutionary process is the volume being turned up on intensity and value and mind in deep ways. You could do a sonic philosophy on those themes. But he makes the claim that all order is aesthetic order. In some deep sense, that's true, right? The emergence of a pattern or of a frequency or of a harmony, right? Even the laws of nature, which are preconditioning everything that we know, are themselves, Whitehead says, an expression of aesthetic order. They express a harmony. Now, Charles Hartshorne, the assistant of Whitehead, who'd later developed insights in the process theological direction, like to say that the laws of harmony, intensity are more ultimate than laws of nature, and the reason for why those laws are. So I think we have to come to terms with this notion that it may be that value, aesthetic value at least, does have an abiding place, and that there is a world that doesn't happen to express a random sort of order. Whitehead says there is a world because there is a more fundamental aesthetic order. If there wasn't an aesthetic order, there wouldn't be a world. And so the question becomes, what the nature of that order? It's like, not only that, but how can aesthetic principles or standards just be in a universe, right? He says there's antecedent standards of value that are in the universe that find expression at every achievement across the evolutionary process. So, I mean, I don't know if that helps. We can't inhabit, again, the aesthetic value of a electron. But Whitehead's saying an electron is an expression of order. of a certain domain of harmony, of a certain inheritance and persistence of not nothing, but value. He even says that existence in itself, any form of existence, is the upholding of value intensity. There's that element of value again. Does that help? I mean, this is imaginative, retrospective from our experience, and based in the conviction that there is uniformity at a metaphysical level.
Hmm. Well, let's maybe start there with this notion of uniformity. And so like the way I've always, this is sort of the way I've always reasoned it, and maybe let's see if it can piece together a bridge here. Is the way I've
Sure.
always the way I've always taken it as like a speculative starting point is that there's uniformity with the laws of physics. There's uniformity in terms of the chemical. There's uniformity in terms of a chemical composition. So, for example, the composition of hydrogen and helium is the same in our neck of the woods as it is some other galaxy far, far away.
Mm-hmm.
Reasoning based on the uniformity of the physical laws and the uniformity of the chemical constituents, that we could say, for example, and this is sort of connected to the I think your exemplification here, is that we could say, for example, organic, this is like the ultimate philosophical dream. Imagine if we had 50 different planets of independent evolutionary processes and we could study those 50. Like, this is just the dream, right? Imagine if we had like actual different case examples of planets, right? Like, but like we could hypothesize at the current state of our knowledge that those organic beings would be based on carbon, or very highly likely based on carbon, given the uniformity of the chemistry. And then you could say, based on the logic of the different solar system organizations, that those organisms would be highly likely, especially in their multicellular form, to develop eyes or something like that, because eyes are detecting light. So there's some sort of oneness, there's some sort of symbiosis between the organism and the environment, and because of the uniformity of the environment, the organisms might evolve along similar pathways that they evolved on Earth just because of that. And so there's a continuity on that level. I guess my question in terms of the uniformity of the universe experiencing itself or having aesthetic principles is I wonder if this is slipping into anthropomorphization, if we're anthropomorphizing the universe, if the universe isn't actually, more alien, that there's qualitative ruptures that that as human beings emerged, like, for example, there's many primatological experiments where they show that our morality has its roots in primates. It's not like morality has its roots in religious organizations, so it goes back to primates or something like that. But that the sort of, like, say, that there is something qualitatively different about the aesthetic sensibilities, the morale, like the Platonic quality, the good, the true, and the beautiful. That I guess that's what I'm getting at, is how can we know whether or not these are novel qualities of the human domain, or whether these are the human subjective experience projecting it into the object?
Yeah, great. That's really great. First, I mean, I do want to be very careful about the anthropomorphizing comment, because that's the last thing we want to do, right? We don't want to naively anthropomorphize the universe to be just like us. But again, we do face the philosophical problem of how we best and properly express the fact that we are the universe, that we are not some random, arguably offshoot, but we could be expressive of what the universe is ultimately up to. So that's a thoroughly coherent claim, but we have to be quite careful about saying that. So when we use the language of experience and life and mind at levels of ontology, obviously we're stretching language here. And so I want to be careful about how we do that. But Whitehead has been critiqued for being anthropomorphic, but it's not naively so. It's an attempt to draw the continuity between human beings as an expression of nature and as an actualization of possibilities inherent in nature. So that's important. Now your other comment, remind me, you were talking about the
Well, this is
Sorry,
more for
say
the
it again.
I think
Yeah,
this is more to the like the
yeah,
exemplification point is that I always thought it's just philosophy at the moment because it's just very speculative. But the
yeah.
hypothesis would be if we like my hypothesis would be, and I'll just throw it back to you, is if we found life on either on a solar system a few light years away or on the other side of the galaxy, that the probability that that's based on carbon would be very high. That there would be a very high likelihood of continuity, and there would also be a high probability that that life would have gone through similar adaptations in regards to the basic sense perceptions that we find valuable, or that rather that life finds valuable here on Earth, just because of the constraints that we know of the physical universe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for saying that again. Would you also say, though, that the mental domain would belong, right? So you said that it would be carbon-based. You said you use the language of life, right? So in some sense, we're drawing a connection between life as we know it, life as it could be there. Would you say mind would also be there? You said value, too, so sensory values, at least.
Yeah, I mean, again, this is sort of where I find the value of a concept like autopoiesis. I guess that would be my hypothesis, and this is like based on Evan Thompson's work.
Yeah.
The connection between life, like the connection between life and mind, is that his basic hypothesis. That actually blew my mind when I first read that, was realizing that a cell, like a single-celled organism, would have basically the same sort of, that it would have a sensory experience, and that it would respond in a similar way to organisms at a higher level. But so like the I guess that would be like the base level assumption, is that there's some unity of life and mind, and that we could assume, based on the constraints we know of physics and chemistry, that it would be somewhat similar throughout our universe, and then any deviation from that expectation would be a surprise.
Yeah, and so I love that. And life and mind, the unity of life and mind, I'd say value has to be included as well in that context. So I would include life-minded value. I just wrote a paper where I do that with Whitehead's living ontology. But your other question too, I recall, it was whether there can be a kind of rupture between these domains, such that what we experience or encounter hypothetically would not at all share. It would be so foreign to us that there is basically no means of us. I mean, how would we know it, right? So that, I think, is really interesting, and I want to allow for radical divergence and radical diversity, but I still think at the level of ontology, there are things that we have to, at least as ontology necessitates, share with these beings. So I don't know if you're speaking ontologically there when you speak about the union of life and mind. I think you would have to, in some sense. I don't think there can be multiple ontologies, as it were. Even if there were, let's say that the different universe, completely different ontology. We could then ask the question about how those ontologies relate to one another, right? And that question of their relation would again push us back down to this fundamental domain of relationality.
Well,
so
this would be the multiverse. Then you have the multiverse. You have then the idea would be, in the multiverse you have different basically constants. The different universes are operating on different constants, but then the argument would be there are very few universes which would have constants which would allow for the emergence of life. How many universes
we know that with respect to this universe, which is quite interesting, this whole fine-tuning, right, as it's called, discussion.
Right. So I guess like the question, the question of this continuity. I think we've been discussing this continuity, and then I guess my question for you on the metaphysical level is there a place, and it's in your book as well with emphasizing continuity, but is there a place in your metaphysics for discontinuity, for ruptures, for difference, which is we don't know how to relate to it? I mean, does that play in, or how do you think of it?
Yeah, good. I mean, I think it's absolutely there. I think you can have vast discontinuities amidst the continuity. So, I mean, for example, what I'm saying, if we restrict our thoughts just to experimentally on this planet, I would say that we have an ontology of life, mind, and value. But look at the utter diversity that we witness even here. It's like, uh, in principle, intelligent octopi in the ocean still express this ontology, but the discontinuities and the divergence between what's possible in terms of diversity is so utterly vast and it's still there. Um, so I want to preserve that when we leverage out to other planets. I mean, so it could be utterly and completely diverse, but human beings are unique with respect to the animal kingdom. Whitehead says the Rubicon is crossed, and in part the advent of conscious, meta-conscious, reflective life is a wild achievement of nature, where we essentially entertain the possible for its value and then strive for its actualization, right? So we clearly see these distinctions between past, present, future, between possible and actual, and we able to ethically, etc., work with them in our experience. I think that's the level of, when it comes to thinking about extraterrestrials, that is quite interesting, because this whole discussion of extraterrestrial commonality is replete in the literature too, right? If there are platonic domains of some kind, wouldn't we also share those aesthetically, morally, ethically, rationally, mathematics, um, with other intelligent conscious minds who have also crossed that threshold or that evolutionary, is it a rupture? I mean, it's almost like a trampoline or something, that nature, a jump in radical novelty where these high levels of what's latent in the ontology are achieved, in profound and wild ways. So I want to preserve that, but I don't think it's a rupture of the ontology, because I think if one's to hold to an ontology, it applies universally. At least that's what I would think. It's very hard for me to think of plurality of ontologies, and again, we don't have strong empirical evidence for multiple universes, but we can speculate about what that would include.
I guess what I think, what I was always inspired by when I was in history, I was hyper obsessed with when I was an undergrad, I was hyper obsessed with the perspective of the Incas when the Spanish arrived. Because
cool.
It's so, to me, that's the best example of a real alien encounter in human history itself, and because these are two civilizations which are genuinely of an independent origin in regards to their writing systems, their technological systems, their languages, and of course their metaphysics, their religious way of seeing the world, and of course that encounter was quite violent, was quite disruptive, was a break in the history of both civilizations in different ways. And I would
Right.
imagine that when we're thinking about the question of decentering in terms of intelligent species, that it would be perhaps a rupture of even a greater intensity or something like that.
Yeah. I mean, it's thoroughly coherent. Actually, Steve Dick has done this quite a bit, right? Leveraging from our experience with other peoples and populations when we're just exploring this planet, and leveraging that out to how it might be when we encounter, if we do encounter other planets. So there's decolonial literature that's written that's quite interesting, that are warning us of colonizing space. Again, if we were to come in contact with other beings, do we just repeat the disasters of our history, terrestrial history? Hopefully not. So I have a colleague, Roland Faber, who I mentioned. He wrote a chapter recently, and it's coming out in a much larger tome that we are editing. This book that we're speaking of is just a sort of partial in chapter form in that book. It's coming with Lexington, Astrophilosophy, Exotheology, and Cosmic Religion. Subtitle is Extraterrestrial Life in a Process Universe. Should be out early next year. But he wrote a chapter called, it's on the Fermi Paradox, and it's on extraterrestrial spiritual life. And he's playing with the notions that, is it the case that intelligent life like ours inevitably destroys itself? We're facing that as a civilization on this planet. if life were to get beyond this rupture, this bottleneck of potential destruction, what is the means for doing so? And he argues that if we are to encounter extraterrestrial beings of a highly more advanced form, they will have had to presumably overcome their barbaric tendencies and origins, and that the only way to do that, he would suggest, is through a kind of spiritual sensibility, a spiritual means. So, I mean, when we think about the horrors of colonization on our planet, it might be wrong for us to project that onto the universe as well. You know, we're struggling with this projection thing, because it may be that beings that we encounter are much more noble, much more spiritually advanced than we are, and that even might be a case for contact, as is, you know, the recent whistleblowing and all this news. You know, so I want to be careful about not saying that the universe is just a dark forest, as has been said, right, where every planet is essentially hiding around a tree for fear of being immediately obliterated when they're witnessed or seen by another planet. That, I think, is a projection of a barbaric Darwinian portrait of the universe, which I think is not the full story on this planet, and I don't think it's the full story beyond it either. So, what do you think? I mean,
Yeah.
various themes
No.
there.
Well, this is why this topic is even like the top of the list of the most fascinating things to think about philosophically, is because there
Yeah.
is so much to discuss, and there is so many speculative avenues to continue to explore. But I mean, I think it is the case that to me it's a mega philosophical problem, that this dimension of projection and history, and how can we, and precisely because of that the first point we were emphasizing about the objectivity, learning about the objectivity through our subjectivity, is that it's because we're always entangled with it all, we're always already entangled with the thing. So it's
Right.
but the examples I wanted to run by you about this, like, you know, the first, I forget the guy's name, but the first people who were hypothesizing about the structures on Mars, they had fuzzy pictures of Mars, and they thought that they saw lines on it, and they thought it was a canal system, and they started to fill in the fuzzy picture with, oh, there's a civilization on Mars, and they have canal systems around the entire planet, and they're at advanced. That it's very easy, you know what I mean? It's very, and then you get a closer up picture, and it's just the geological formations and stuff like that. But
yeah, oh man, disappointment.
Right, but I think there is this dimension of we, and this is to me, we, and myself included, we desire contact. You know, like, we desire contact for,
Yeah.
you know, and so it's hard to, and that's you know, when science, even like the whole point behind scientific objectivity, I feel, is they try to have a form of scientific objectivity so that we can get rid of our desires and passions, and the way our desires and passions might color the picture, because that was the whole problem for science, you know, before, because it was like, we're in this universe of myth and projections everywhere of angels and demons, and how can we just get a clear picture of the universe and so forth. So I feel like it's interesting the way in which it comes back with the question of aliens, you know.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I really like those comments. Yeah, no, it is circulating back in a certain way, you know. I just think that also, you know, you mentioned we need to exclude certain mythic dimensions, you know, and that can apply at various levels. But I think what we don't want to exclude nowadays, an increasingly number of scientists, physicists, et cetera, are coming to this, is the subjective element in us, is the mental element, is the value. But you see statements all the time by popular scientists like Neil deGrasse Tyson, right? The universe is blind to our sorrows and indifferent by our pain. Like, have a nice day. You know, they show the picture of the Earth, you know, and then the wider universe. The universe doesn't care. That's the conclusion. I just think those are philosophically lazy comments, because while science wants to give us objectivity and has, we've had tremendous advances. The time has come for us to reincorporate or break this dualism or bifurcation that's happened, that has excluded the most intimate part of the objective world that we know, and that is us. You know, so it's not as if Whitehead is not operating on this Kantian approach where, you know, we don't know the world in and of itself because, you know, we formulate it through just the cognitive structures we have. He says the subject emerges from the object and not the other way around. The world produces beings of this kind that are subjective, right? There's a through line between the subjective and the objective. And even at the level of ontology for Whitehead, it's there. An event emerges subjectively, achieves something, dies, and becomes an object for every other event. Objectivity is the achievement. Objectivity is past, but not just only not only present per se, right? The objective world is flowing into us in every moment, but we subjectively determine that world in each and every moment as well. So anyway, I liked your comments. We'd have come back around to the projection. We have to be careful with it. We have to, it's a philosophical question as to how we best incorporate and express the fact that we're part of nature. And this is this theme that's been a part of this discussion the whole time. And I don't know if we've reached the correct way of doing that, but that's certainly, man, if you look at the literature over and over and over, you have discussions of anthropomorphism, etc. But they're sort of counter anthropomorphic by saying it's like positive anthropomorphism, you know, if there is such a thing. So
Well,
I struggle with that.
Even geology, like let's think about how it's coming up in geology. Is that in geology, it's we're in the Anthropocene. You know, like now we're in the Anthropocene, and why we're in the Anthropocene is because whatever the very force of our own species leaves a geological imprint. And like you were saying, and I like this point very much, that any species that could, let's say, leave its home planet, just based on what I know of 20th century, 21st century humans exploring the solar system, is it seems like we shouldn't underestimate that any species that leaves its home planet and can go around the solar system or the galaxy would have to be, I think, some sort of trans biotechno hybrid, because the organic is so evolutionarily linked to the home planet, like that the body, I mean, is like for example, like around our solar system, we have our satellites all over the place. But we can only go to the moon, and we even don't bother to do that anymore. You know, so it's like, you know,
India did just recently, apparently, at least with their you know, robots.
But like that we can easily go technologically, but any species that had as it were consolidated the geopolitics of its home planet in such a way that it was sustainable in the long term would have had to go through some sort of bottleneck in regards to its own existential threat to itself, and that this would require some sort of innovation of an order that we still are presently not capable of sustaining in any way.
Indeed. Yeah, no, I think that's such an important and interesting point. And that's also why this AI discussion is quite interesting when it comes to space exploration. We've already been doing it, right? We have rovers on Mars, etc. But I mentioned the text that's going to be coming out. And in that text that Faber and I are editing, Noreen Hersfield, who's an expert in AI, philosophy and AI, has a great chapter precisely on this, right? And it's about the basically our biological bottleneck, our terrestrial bottleneck. We're organic creatures linked to this planet, and we really stand no chance of sustaining the kind of magnitudes, the sidereal magnitudes of space with our biological nature. We can't do it. Now, there's often very confident claims that robots can, or intelligent extraterrestrial life can. Certainly they could, to the extent that we can't, you know. But even then, there's questions raised about the capacities of AI at certain magnitudes of space. But it seems to be the case that if we are to make contact, that our technology is going to be the means through doing that, and particularly AI, potentially technology. And if we are to encounter other beings, it might be us encountering them through our technology encountering theirs. You know. So we're still at the beginning of this conversation too, but it is fascinating and challenging to conceive.
This is the level of so there's in the Evo Devo community, they have you have, of course, astrophysics, then astrobiology, and then they say we need astrotechnology as well. We need to think astro technologically as well. But so we've gone through the negations, and specifically the way you turn these negations into exemplifications. Now, what are the stakes, or what's your aim with the other 4 points? And maybe we could go through those, which are more way Stephen's affirming certain principles, and do you have a different aim there? Because if with the first 3 principles there's an inversion, with the last 3 principles, what's your aim of engagement here?
Yeah, so the inversions are not so obvious in the last 3 principles, 4, 5, and 6, but they aim to be certainly consistent with the inversions of the first 3, and so I'm still playing on what I interpret to be cosmological negations in these, and I guess we can get into that by just looking to the 4th principle. So recall that Steve says that cosmotheology must be open to radical and non-supernatural conceptions of God, a God grounded in cosmic evolution. And absolutely, the problem, the negation that occurs at this level for Steve, though, is quite interesting. So he has these cosmological negations in the first 3 principles. What I discern in the 4th principle is a jump to an ontological negation of God, right? So Steve will tell you that he might just as well call his naturalistic cosmotheology cosmophilosophy, because he sort of gives a reduced definition of theology as simply whatever can give meaning to life. So my critique in the 4th principle is to metaphysically invert this ontological negation of God. Now, Steve's proposal is quite interesting. It's not only his. Nick Bostrom, others have written about the evolution of a very highly intelligent superintelligence, a naturalistic superintelligence. And again, to say it's naturalistic is only to say that it's a product of cosmological evolution. And he even suggests, Steve does, that it could be a naturally evolved, highly evolved superintelligence that could have fine-tuned these constants that we had mentioned previously that allow us to be here. So that's all quite interesting. But this is where I push back metaphysically at Steve and try to point to several problems that I discern in his notion of a highly evolved superintelligence as essentially making, or as essentially fulfilling the function of classical understandings of God, right? Omnipotence, omniscience, etc. So, I mean, I might go into that a little bit. The first thing to say with respect to Whitehead, his naturalism is not the same naturalism as Steve's. So Steve's naturalism requires him to negate the reality of God out of existence, this ontological negation. Again, we cross from the cosmological negation to the ontological negation. Whitehead's, by contrast, actually allows him to reaffirm the reality of God, albeit as the chief expression of metaphysical principles and not their exception. So this is a claim of naturalism, but it's not an atheistic naturalism. I think that's important in the science religion discussion, because it's often thought, right, that naturalism presupposes atheism, which I think is false. So I think atheism obviously presupposes naturalism, but naturalism does not presuppose atheism. There's a variety of proposals that are naturalistic, but nevertheless theologically realistic. So my critique of Steve is that his naturalistic cosmotheology is ultimately anti-realist in nature, and that making it anti-realist leaves open some metaphysical gaps that an affirmation of God, at least traditionally, had filled. It's not to say that we have to now affirm a traditional affirmation of God, but that there are certain metaphysical holes that reason the reality of God that are still open in Steve's proposal. So you can have the naturalism he wants, but without the ontological negation of God. A couple just other problems, and then maybe I'll just let you respond to this one. He doesn't want to associate possibilities with God. He says, I resonate with Whitehead, but without making the connection between possibilities and God. So the reason possibility is so fascinating to me philosophically is there's an infinite domain of potency in the nature of things. We're an expression of it. Possibilities have a pseudo, what would we call it, kind of Platonic-like character, but that they're there in the nature of things is a presupposition of our existence and experience. especially in a process of a revolutionary universe. So one question is the question of the locus of the possible. Another would be the locus of value that comes along with possibilities, arguably, in a deep sense. Steve says that the super intelligence itself is a product of cosmological evolution. Okay, so it's an actualization of a possibility, but not that possibility's ground, right? So that would be an important distinction. God is the ground of the possible is something Whitehead arguably affirms. It's what the classical tradition has affirmed. And then just a last comment on the fine-tuning issue. There seems to be a challenge for me, paradox, logical paradox, or even contradiction, in the claim that a highly evolved superintelligence itself is responsible for fine-tuning the cosmological constants. To me, it's simple. I mean, you can't at once be the product of those cosmological constants and have tuned them at the same time, right? There's a problem there. There's an imminent problem there. That you're an expression of the constants which you're said to tune yourself, but those constants are the ground of your cosmological being in the first place. So there needs to be pushed back again to something arguably necessary, something that grounds the possible, something that would be the precondition of these cosmological constants being the way they are. So I know that's a lot, and we're sort of jumping through different problems that emerge in that chapter. But maybe I'll let you respond at this point.
Okay, so there's so many things I could respond.
Sorry.
No, but no, it's a good thing. I'm spoiled for choice here. And maybe I can use this being spoiled for choice as a kind of meta example. So I'm spoiled for choice, and that's why, because I have so many possibilities in front of me in terms of the discourse we could pursue. And then the problem with being spoiled for choice is that I have to, as it were, contingently choose what becomes our necessity. Right? Like, so in our conversation, like, you know what I mean? Like in the conversation itself, I have to freely choose what becomes the necessary direction for the thing. But it's, in some sense, there is an element of freedom here. There is a certain groundlessness here where necessity is it, like, this is to me the interesting philosophical paradox, where necessity is itself contingent. So, like, in regards to, and how can we think a necessity which is itself, because in the pre-modern, and this is like the difference with the pre-modern, and this is, we could think about this in terms of we need different geometries than they had in the pre-modern world to think this. So, like, for example, in the pre-modern world, the necessity was precisely the necessity on the fact that it wasn't contingent, right? Like, this is the God. It's not a contingent God. It's all paths lead to this necessity, no matter what. But I think that, like, for example, my favorite example is actually in love relationships. Is like when you meet, like basically the person that you end up marrying, or the person that you end up spending your life with, was contingent. There were many possibilities, but then you contingently stumble upon a necessity. And so, just thinking about how can we think about this in the context, and this is going to sound weird, but how can we think about this in the context of super intelligence and fine-tuning constants? Like, is it possible to think in this way? And I think that, like, for example, I'll throw it back to you, but this really is the favorite thing for me to think, is because it pushes me to the place I can't think anymore, is Richard Feynman, for example, or not Richard Feynman, who was it? David Deutsch said, the quantum computer scientist. He said that it's not quantum physics or quantum computing doesn't mean that we live in a quantum computer, but that we live in a universe where sort of the possibilities to fine-tune the world itself are imminent to the world itself. So, like, just that with, like, the technological capacities that we're coming into, that there's contingently the possibility to fine-tune different worlds or something like that. And how can we think about that in regards to a cosmic evolutionary picture?
Yeah. Oh man, it's such a fun discussion. Well, I think, I mean, arguably the debate is wide with respect to fine tuning too, right? So even using the language of fine tuning, is like, oh, there's a fine tuner, right? So, and some people will be very skeptical of that. But with respect to possibility and fine tuning, it's so fascinating because, and I'll speak of Whitehead here for a moment. In order for there to be anything at all, arguably, possibilities have to be limited in a very certain way. You can't have all possibilities actualized at the same time without chaos and utter disorder, right? As the tradition has said, it'd be incompossible to have all possibilities be actualized. What we see, I think, in the fine tuning is a limitation on the possible, and we have a right to ask, why not otherwise? And Whitehead even says at a lower level, he speaks of the absurdly limited 3 dimensions of space. Why not 4? Why not 14, 13, whatever. And so we face the fact of possibilities being limited such that something can arise within them, or that the limitation of the possible in some way canalizes a certain path towards realization and actualization. There might be a lot of freedom and creativity in that. He certainly thought so. But the question, I think, theologically or metaphysically, is the nature of that limitation. What is it that is able to limit possibilities in that way? We're certainly able to do that in our own experience. So we have an imminent ability, as you said, to limit the possible. We do it all the time with every decision that we make. Perhaps the universe itself has that ability as well. Perhaps there's a mental domain to the universe, right? Again, Whitehead's speaking of God not as some exterior transcendent entity outside the universe. He's talking about the infinite depth of the cosmos itself in a deep way. There's an immanent dimension to God, what he calls the consequent nature, that's evolving and in constant relationship with everything. And there's a transcendent dimension, the primordial nature, which is this primordial ground of timeless value. So in principle, it would be out of the primordial nature of God in some way that these limitations on the possible would happen. It's not right to say they're from the outside, but in a sense, even from our experience, these limitations have to be there for there presumably to be a universe. I'm not saying there's a time when there's not a universe. I think the universe is probably infinite or goes through infinite cycles. But still, it's the nature of this limitation and the nature of the possible. One, how can possibilities exist and function in the way they do? Like, it's a question of their ontological locus, their status, their relevance to actuality in every moment. Possibilities are constantly being limited, and not just by our choices. Possibilities come to us as limited as relevant. Why? How? And you can ask that at the highest possible level. What is the reason for the limitation of the possible? What is the selecting factor, as physicists will put it? And why is it the way that it is? One way to think about that is that possibilities are limited in a certain way so that they can achieve certain values. And we're back to this value achievement question again. We see this in our experience, and it seems right to some extent that these panoply of constants are limited in such a way so that something of value, something of life and mind and value can actually emerge, and not just here, potentially everywhere. So, I'm circling around, but these are really metaphysical questions, not just scientific questions too. Even if you say, well, they are that way because of multiple universes that are popping, possibilities into being, you still face similar kinds of questions as to fine-tuning of multiverses, relationships between universes. You still face problems of the possible. One function God has held in the tradition is the mind in which infinite possibilities reside. And it may sound trite, but it's not, because our only access to the possible is through our mental domain. And we know that there's possibilities that are transcendent, that precondition us before arguably any mind existed. Do they too require a locus in mind? It's not, I think, an absurd step to make that claim, but it does require some imagination. So anyway, what do you think?
Yeah, it's definitely, to me, pointing in the right direction to think about the relationship between possibilities and limitation. And the way in which limitation is fundamental, and also to think about this historically in relationship to human civilization, is that throughout all of human history, human species was so fundamentally limited by nature itself and civilization itself. Like we didn't have, like, for example, me and my friends would say something like, after a Friday night out at a restaurant, we ate better than the king of England in the 16th century or something like that. And we can all sort of eat better than the king of England in the 16th century now. And even like having like I could have 2 or 3 showers a day, it doesn't matter. Whereas people in the 16th century, they may have a bath once a week or something like that. So like, but just
Right.
the point being that human beings were so fundamentally externally limited in the past, and now increasingly the real challenge is to internally limit ourselves. Like now we have to internally limit. We have to prevent ourselves from overeating, or we have to
Yeah.
or even, like, for example, on the dating market, we have to limit ourselves to a single partner or something like that, where there's so many options just on your phone. So
Right.
this question of imminent limitation, to me, is an interesting one to think about philosophically. So I think it's a very
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, and we see the detriments of not employing proper limitations too. I mean, I take your point, thinking about raising kids, and I don't know if you have kids or not, but but just at every level of life, that limitation has to be implemented properly. Otherwise chaos ensues. So existentially, like what we're saying from this huge cosmological level applies right here and now. If there was no limitation on the possible in the universe, and some have wanted to say that, well, everything that can happen will happen. I think that's a horrific perspective. If there's no limitation on the limitation on the possible, and if that limitation isn't gauged by value, we're in a scary spot. And we see that. I think I've seen that in my life, frankly.
Yeah, it's like when chaos is happening, God is too close.
Right, yeah.
If Whitehead's
Some would
right
argue,
about,
yeah.
right, if Whitehead's right about the God impossibility. But let's go into the final two, 5 and
Okay, yeah.
6. So with 5, we have cosmotheology must have a moral dimension extending to embrace all species in the universe, a reverence and a respect for life in any form. And I think this is an interesting one to discuss. I don't want to bias you in any direction, but I would want to bring up that dimension again, where, for example, the meeting between Europe and the Incas, or Spain and the Incas, was in some sense this meeting between two moral dimensions, and there's huge conflict is that, can we assume that this moral dimension extends in such a harmonious way?
Yeah, good. Well, quickly, I think no, like we shouldn't make that quick assumption that any more than we would that, obviously we see different dimensions of morality just on our own terrestrial planet, radically different in some ways, but there are nevertheless deep similarities as well. Some might also argue, like the case, that we share more moral commonality than we might think with other cultures. So yeah, so again, yeah, this is the 5th principle. Steve wants to make the case, or hold on to this place of a moral sense of treating life with reverence and respect. And my response, again, to state my principle, is that cosmotheology must not just have the moral sense, but has to provide, remember, we're talking about theology. Cosmotheology must provide the ontological basis for and the stimulus for this moral sense, and why pursuing it is ultimately worthwhile. So again, I want to push back to this ontological, this metaphysical dimension. Now, earlier you mentioned, I think as sort of a side comment, truth, beauty, and goodness, right? These ancient transcendentals. Now, arguably, as Whitehead holds, there are standards, objective standards of value that lace the nature of things. They evolve, certainly, but they evolve not out of nothing, but out of an axiological base. Call it truth, beauty, and goodness. In fact, he even has a great statement, theopoetic statement, where he speaks of God as the poet of the world with tender patience, leading it by his vision of truth, beauty, and goodness. Very famous statement. So what I'm pushing for on this is for Steve to develop an ontological foundation for that would justify and support us treating life with reverence and respect. So it's clearly the case that we're not morally central. We said that in the first principle. But if we're not morally central, then neither is any other species on any other planet. So it raises this larger question as to whether there really is an ontological center in which the values we assign with morality are instantiated. And that would categorically, in principle, condemn something like a cosmological holocaust from taking place. We want to affirm an ontology that would say that's a bad thing, definitively. That's an evil thing. So I'm pushing back again for the ground of axiological distinctions. And I'm making the case on Whitehead that his understanding of God allows for grounding value in a way that an affirmation of a superintelligence that's contingently evolved through evolution simply does not. So, I mean, there's the naturalistic fallacy, supernaturalistic fallacy. There's different dimensions of this, but I'll let you comment on that for now.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is an interesting thought experiment as well. Like, it's coming to my mind is the cosmological holocaust is like,
Mm-hmm.
in some sense, like, what do we do to, how are we to deal with a situation where can we jump? It sounds like almost, is it even possible to jump ahead of ourselves to establish a certain cosmotheology, which would establish something like almost something that humans historically have only been able to do retrospectively. Like, so for example, after the Holocaust, there are certain political meetings, certain political agreements which are established between nations and peoples, which would try to prevent that from happening. But in some sense, it seems like it's something that needs to come out of a response to the goodness is coming as a response to the evil happening. So I'm just trying to say, is this trying to get ahead of that in some sense to establish a good without going through the evil itself?
Well, it would be great if it could do that, right? Stubbornly on this planet, we seem to the value dimension emerges and often through tumultuous situations. But yeah, I mean, it would be utterly tragic if we encountered, at least in my perspective, we encountered other beings and it was one of colossal destruction. So I guess what I'm trying to point to, again, pointing down to, because I'm trying to cosmologically or metaphysically deepen Dick's cosmotheology, is to say that there's an inescapable value dimension to ontology. We seem to all inevitably presuppose, even if we theoretically deny it, the reality of value, of objective value. And even atheist philosophers say this. I think of Thomas Nagel, who I'm rereading his book, Mind and Cosmos, great book. He holds the objectivity of value in the universe. Derek Parfit also did the same. Both of them didn't draw the theistic kinds of conclusions, but arguably, I would say there's a hole in their ontology. So in principle, if the universe itself proceeds out of a concern for value, say based on the limitation of the possible, we might think of that in fine-tuning, and that these values in principle are discernible and appreciable by highly evolved beings like ourselves, moral values, that's a basis for which we might speak about the developing sense of reverence and respect for life between at an interplanetary level. That's not to say we might not, we see on our planet horrors, but we share much. So I fully affirm that planets, cultures will disagree as to what is moral or immoral, but that there is a difference between them, I think, is inevitably presupposed. And I think that's what I want to try to tap into at an interplanetary level. Does that make sense?
I think so. It's these questions make my head spin. The first thing I'm thinking about is like the paradoxes of the way we treat other organisms. Why do we for example say steak from a cow is okay, but if you have a dog burger, this is not okay. like
Right. There's an
right,
arbitrariness to that.
right. There's or like, for example, I saw someone, like, there's a meme joking, for example, like, if you kill a spider, you're a hero. If you kill a butterfly, you're the enemy. Like
You're a
that,
monster, right? Yeah.
right? You're a monster. Like, so my first thing
Sure.
is, I hope the aliens think we're beautiful. Like, if the aliens think we're beautiful, then we're spared. And if the aliens think we're like a slug, like some, like, if the aliens think, like, for example, here in my backyard, every night, there's these massive slugs that come out, and they're just disgusting looking. But like, I don't have any issues with these I want these slugs to be chucked away. Like, if I'm, but if
Right.
so, but just if the aliens view us as that, through that aesthetic lens, I
Mhm,
wonder,
mhm.
this is, I guess that's the question I'll throw back at you, is like, I like the example you were
Okay.
giving earlier about how different, like, for example, octopus experience might be.
Mhm.
For example, like, totally different sensory experiences. What what we find aesthetic versus what the octopus finds aesthetic, like, so through the body of the organism. I wonder if we can think aesthetics on that level.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, I certainly think we can. And well, just to back up for a moment, I'm not prescribing any set of morality here, right? As to ethical actions or codes, right? So the dog example you gave is really good. Um, but there has been this element of moral progress I think we'd point to in our civilization, in our culture, right? There's some things that, whereas they were commonplace in antiquity, we view them as anathema now, right? There's been an element of moral progress. So, and that means moral progress in the universe, because again, we're not an isolated, you know, enclave here in the universe. The aesthetic sense, I think, can be very different, certainly, with the octopus and what they might recognize as pleasing or unpleasing. At a higher level, I'd say our existence, the fact that we're here, ordered, harmonized in the way that we do, the amount of order that has to be in place for us and an octopus to experience is already, for Whitehead and for me, an expression of aesthetic achievement. The universe is in the business of making aesthetic achievements. And interior to those achievements are the appreciation by those achievements, right, of aesthetics themselves. But aesthetics is fun too, because there's an element of it that's very elusive. And like, we even see this in art. Some art is objectively beautiful, and some beauty, some aesthetic attraction, you need to be awoken to. It requires discipline. It requires sensitivity. Um, you spend time with it, and then you get it. And so I wonder, at the level of different species or different, just on this planet, there's an attentive sense that we may completely lack. You know, um, and they might have an aesthetic sense in ways far different than us, but I still want to push to a certain element of commonality between the aesthetic sense, because I located it in the ontology. I have to do that. So what is it that intelligent aliens will see as beautiful? I would expect them to see the harmony of their landscape, see as beautiful. Uh, the harmony of color, the patterns of color, the harmony of mathematics, um, the harmony of human life. And again, Whitehead makes the claim that the moral order is really just certain aspects of the aesthetic order. There can be a harmony of human life and human relationship that can be appreciated as beautiful. But I love the idea of extraterrestrial music, art, literature, religion. All of these have expressive aesthetic domains, and we can, I think, only imagine what they could be. Uh, but I do think that's something that might be a basis for our commonality, and that would be quite interesting, right? So the movie Contact, uh, the connection that's made is at a mathematical level, but also at an aesthetic level. This appreciation of pattern and the recognition of pattern as associated with intelligence too. So again, I want to allow for the diversity of aesthetic sense and appreciation, but push for a certain connection that is inexorable as well. What do you think?
Gotcha. Well, I'm just thinking. I mean, again, it's just explosive, the number of ideas, I think, that come out of this topic. It's it's one of the reasons I
Truly,
wanted
yeah.
to have one of the reasons I wanted to have this conversation. So what one of the things I was thinking I could push on a little bit is, so the thought experiment I always run is like, if and this is just a thought experiment, but imagine you're a disembodied observer at the earliest moments of the universe. It's just like a cosmic plasma, and then you don't know anything else just but what you're seeing in that early universe picture, and then you, for example, see like an elephant or a whale, and you're like, how did the universe like that, how did the universe get from this cosmic plasma to an elephant or a whale? Like, it's so different. Like, how do we get from here to that? Like, it's such a qualitative rupture. And then,
Yeah.
like, so in that same way is like, when we think about, for example, you mentioned extraterrestrial music, art, literature, is like, it's not, for example, there are many humans that don't understand quantum mechanics, but for something like a chimpanzee or a gorilla, it's that quantum mechanics is just not a part of their hermeneutical horizon. Like, they can't understand quantum mechanics. Like, there's not even a condition of possibility for understanding quantum mechanics. Whereas for humans, there's at least that condition of possibility. And so in that sense, I'm thinking is, can we think of, like, how would you deal with the problem of another species with something so different from us as, for example, let's say a slug and mathematics or something like that, but it's so impossible, you know what I mean? Like, that there's an like, and I think even like this is a relevant question internal to the human species with artificial intelligence and stuff like that. Like, if, for example, like, I don't know, I mean, it's a whole other topic, but if, for example, there's an artificial general intelligence, it might not be that they're just like super good mathematicians or something like that. It could be that they're totally there's a totally qualitatively different thing that interests them, which we don't even have conditions of possibility for thinking.
Yeah, I like the way you phrased that. And the chimpanzee, or even the slug in mathematics gap, that's a big one. Although, what do we know? What is it? Maybe a slug is capable of things that again, we don't have the conditions of possibility for. I want to allow for that, absolutely. And it's like, it's just so hard because this is very imaginative. It's hard for us to get a grip on what that would be, because, well, we don't have the conditions of possibility. But I think it would be like take music, for example, right? Assuming that we have auditory neighbors who are communicating and being creative through sound and through expression, which seems potentially likely. Would we recognize it as music? And that's interesting. Philosophy of music is quite an interesting field. I think to do so, we'd have to discern some element of harmony, right? Harmony of contrasts, rising and falling of the tones, and so it's like, I want to say that there's a way that we could still be connected. Like, there could be wildly diverse extraterrestrial music. Like, we have trance, and we have Mozart, and then we have thrash metal. All these are wildly different, but they express still certain patterns of possibility. Whitehead has a great statement, since he loved music, where he speaks about a composer who's writing a composition. He said, and he has this image. He says, all around him hover these infinitudes of possibility, other ways that this composition might have been expressed. So there's possibilities for utterly divergent aesthetic achievement musically and in other domains. But there's still that element of harmony that I think has to be discerned for us to appreciate it as music. When you come to art, that's much different. Recognitions of art, the pattern of harmony is still there, but there's all sorts of stuff that's artistically amazing that we overlook and don't recognize, just simply because we haven't been sensitized to it. So it's one question as to whether the gap is so much that we can't never have the conditions of possibility for recognizing it. And it's another to say, could we learn, supposing the conditions of possibility to not recognize it, we're not there. There is a possibility. Could we tune ourselves to appreciate a form of musical expression, aesthetic intensity, etc.? Taste is another thing. Art, diet. I mean, but I don't. I'm speculating here.
No, this is very important, and this is also a good expression, I think, of, again, the relationship between the subject and the object. That
Yeah,
like
yeah,
the objectivity is involving our own attunement to what is beautiful, or like, for example, because I grew up in a lower class, I'll always have a lower class sensibility in terms of food. Like no matter,
yeah.
you know what I mean? Like, but I have to attune myself to the to a higher class of food or something like that. But
But you're
okay, so
still
let's.
eating better than than the pharaohs.
That's true. That's true. That's true. Yeah.
Potentially, yeah.
Yeah. So let's go into the last one, which is cosmotheology must embrace the idea that human destiny should be linked to natural cosmic events and not the divine. What are you trying to get at with this last or what are you trying to do with Dick's principle here?
Yeah, yeah. So the way I phrase it, inverted in a certain way, is that cosmotheology must embrace human destiny as inextricably linked to the destiny of the cosmos. And then what I say is, as an infinite evolutionary expression of these metaphysical conditions that are chiefly expressed by the divine. So again, Steve Dick wants to make this bifurcation between presumably a supernatural God and just the universe, and say, well, we can just have a cosmic destiny of appreciation of the cosmos, etc. I want to say, well, God is already inevitably wrapped up into that on a Whiteheadian scale. Uh, the achievement of value that's taking place across cosmic evolution. The destiny we have, Steve, largely, if I recall, has two options, right? Either we are alone and we die alone in the universe. We don't make contact. There is no other. In other words, we don't live in a biological universe. That's one option. We are alone in the universe, which raises fantastic questions itself, right? Scary questions. Or the universe is replete with life, and part of our destiny for him is to potentially make contact with that life, to explore the kinds of questions you and I have been discussing this whole time. He opts for the latter. He's very imaginative. I love that about his work. And I think both of those are interesting options. When it comes to Whitehead's thinking, the universe is in the business of teleological achievement, not in a naive sense, but he makes a great statement in his book, Adventures of Ideas, which I recommend to everyone. He says the teleology of the universe is directed towards the production of beauty. And there is no state of the universe where experience and mind and value will be fully devoid or absent. So the process of the universe for Whitehead, as divinely lured, is towards an infinite achievement of value intensity. And it might be a finite game. It might be an infinite game, as one author put it, rather than a finite game. So it's not a matter of teleology. We achieve it, and then the process stops. Right? That aesthetic achievement of beauty, of value, is an infinite game that the universe will perpetually move towards. And we may not be a part of that because we know our sun is going to die out. We know that we're not going to be here as a planetary or solar species. But purpose doesn't have to do with the end state of just things. It's like if it did, then the purpose of your life would be your corpse, and I don't think anybody wants to say that. So purpose on a Whiteheadian scheme, purpose in the way that I'm putting forth, even destiny, has to do with the states of value that are achieved in and through the process. And I think for Whitehead's universe, at least, for the universe that I find attractive, this pursuit of beauty is precisely in that context. Purpose is linked to achieved value, and that striving for achieved value is what the universe is doing infinitely. So that's a rough frame of the direction of that
Yeah.
last point.
Well, I can say amen to that, and
Good.
I think no, it's definitely it's interesting to see the convergence in terms of the way you're using Whitehead and some of the other sort of philosophical inclinations that I've had in regards to the true, the good, and the beautiful. And yeah, it's certainly interesting. I guess the main I want to ask maybe one question that might be sort of pointing towards a potential antagonism between Whitehead and Chardin, Teilhard de Chardin, specifically on this question of the end point. So it's this idea that you're saying Whitehead is saying with this adventure of ideas, production of beauty, it might be an infinite game. That it's not that there's an actual end state, that the ends, like to reify an end state is kind of like reifying a corpse, like the purpose is a process, it's ongoing and so forth. But when I read
Right.
Chardin's work, for example, there's this idea of the omega point. There's this idea of the end, almost like this divine end state of the absolute reflecting on itself at the end of time. So do you think that this is is this where these thinkers diverge, or is there something else going on here?
Good question, and it's a timely question. Just as a side note, I was just in Philly at Villanova University, and we just had a Whitehead Teilhard conference, which was leveraging precisely this kind of eschatological question in the context of their work. So there's no doubt they have so many fascinating similarities. In fact, Teilhard at least quotes Whitehead once in a letter, but their contemporaries didn't have any meeting as far as we know. That would also be an interesting coffee date, not just Heidegger and Hawking, but Teilhard and Whitehead. So this omega point is quite interesting. And yeah, the distinction that's often made is that Teilhard has more of a determinist teleology, whereas Whitehead has no absolute sort of end state or goal in mind. In fact, he dismisses he calls it fallacious that certain religious systems have this endpoint, right? That there is such an order that's so complete that all other options are excluded. So he denies that. In principle, Teilhard also does that. I've been hearing some Teilhard scholars talk about the omega point, which is not just out there, it's here too, right? It's both here and there, alpha and omega in a deep way. So I think there's ways to bring Whitehead and Teilhard closer, but to the extent, if we interpret Teilhard to mean that there is a final stop to the cosmic process, where the goal is achieved, and who knows how to imagine that, then Whitehead does disagree with that, right? So that would be picturing teleology as an ultimately finite game, not an infinite game. So, but I don't think Teilhard has to be read that way. And I'm convinced after reading him quite a bit recently and hearing recent Teilhard scholars talk about him that it could be conceived as a more of an infinite kind of thing as well. If it is, Whitehead and him come closer, but it's certainly the case for Whitehead that he doesn't envision a final achievement eschatologically that happens and then the process stops. It's a realized eschatology, if you want. It's happening at every moment. God, as it were, does not wait till the end. God inhales every moment as it occurs and breathes it back into the world. And that process is an infinite process, the process of valuation of beauty, of aesthetics. So they're fascinating thinkers. They do come close, but I think you're pointing to the right area of where we can see some divergence. Because Teilhard at some point says, well, there's no guarantee we'll get to the omega. Other points, he says, he seems pretty damn sure that we're going to get there and we have to.
All right. Well, this has been a lot of fun. I really enjoy
Absolutely.
this topic. I think that the topic of extraterrestrial life, and specifically the way you're, not only the topic of extraterrestrial life, but specifically the way you are bringing it reflectively back to human philosophy, human religion, and the potential consequences of that collision. It does bring something novel to the literature, which I deeply appreciate. So I just recommend everyone to pick up Metaphysics of EXO-LIFE. I enjoyed the read very much, and I'll leave a link in the description for anyone who's interested in picking that up. I'll just say, do you have any final thoughts or reflections, either about your text or about what you're up to moving forward for the viewers? And I'll leave links in the description to your website as well.
Perfect. Yeah, well, to you, thank you. It's been a very stimulating conversation. Good to have a new philosophical friend. So I hope we do get a chance to talk again. Just for viewers, my previous book, Mind, Value, and Cosmos, on the relational nature of ultimacy, is relevant to some of these themes. It doesn't go in directly in the way that this book does. But also just another comment that this book in an earlier chapter form is going to appear in a much larger tome that's on the way in a couple months from Lexington Press. And so part of my interest is, again, to make up for this lacuna in the literature. And there's other projects I mentioned, exo-axiology, this question of value beyond Earth that I'm beginning to consider with a few thinkers as well. But love to stay in touch. I love to continue the conversation. So yeah, andrewmdavis.info or my YouTube channel as well are good ways to stay up to date on what I'm doing, as well as visiting the Center for Process Studies, which continually is doing conferences. We're partnering with Ian McGilchrist in San Francisco next year to do an event on his work, and we have a lot of fun things on the horizon. So I'd love to stay in touch with you, Fidel, and also your listeners for those, and perhaps meet in person one day.
All right, that sounds great. I'm definitely open to it, and definitely whenever there's a future project or whatever, consider me a friend on the journey. So with that being
Sure.
said, I again recommend Metaphysics of EXO-LIFE, and for everyone else, thanks for watching and have a great evening.
I hope you enjoyed this conversation with Dr. Andrew Davis on the metaphysics of EXO-LIFE. Throughout the conversation, we tried to explore the connections between Whitehead's process philosophy with Dick's 6 principles of naturalistic cosmotheology, which Dick thinks will be necessary to evaluate in the context of future discoveries in cosmology as it relates to our presuppositions about life and mind. If you are interested in diving into this work yourself, I encourage you to pick up Dr. Davis's book, The Metaphysics of EXO-LIFE, which I found to be an original work at the intersection of various fields, including metaphysics, theology, and cosmology. This Philosophy Portal conversation series is only the surface of Philosophy Portal. At philosophyportal.online, you will find extremely high-level courses teaching the foundation of philosophy. So far, our work has covered the works of Hegel, Nietzsche, Freud, Lacan, and Zupančič. If you are new to philosophy, looking to deepen your knowledge, or need something that will complement your doctoral or professional studies in philosophy, Philosophy Portal is a great place to start. We also host conferences, produce anthologies, and are looking to expand our services in 2024. If you want to help Philosophy Portal grow, you can also help out by becoming a supporter on Patreon, or a paid subscriber on Substack. Links in the description. I hope you enjoyed this conversation with Dr. Davis as much as I did.